Welcome to part one of the setup analysis where we feature the Yonex SV98 Lite, and in the racket we've got it strung up with Signum Pro Firestorm 1.30. So I'll go through some of the strengths, some of the weaknesses from the first couple hours of play and any other thoughts I have regarding the setup. Right, we'll start off with the main strength of the setup, which is the drastic increase in length control from our previous setup, which was the same racket but with the Prince Tournament Nylon 1.38. And with this increase in length control, we have access to a variety of shots that we didn't have when we were using the previous string. So for example, I can now hit sharper angles off of both wings, and that means I can use different strategies against my opponents. So if they have a weakness moving beyond the sidelines, now I have a setup that allows me to exploit that weakness. So it's very good to have different strategies available to the user. And on top of that, it's not just angles, it's also different heights that the user now has access to. I didn't have the ability to hit 5 or 6 foot above the net with the Prince Tournament Nylon and have the ball dip in comfortably, whereas with the Firestorm, this is a viable option all the time, especially when you've got time to set up your shot. You can hit with extreme height over the net, and you can exploit the conditions if they call for it. If you're on a particularly high bouncing surface and the sun is out and it's making it uncomfortable for your opponent, you can use height as a weapon and try and get it out of the strike zone of your opponent, draw errors that way, or even push your opponent further back behind the baseline, and that brings in drop shots and angles even more so into play. So in comparison to the Tournament Nylon string, I wouldn't be surprised if the Firestorm hits a higher spin rate, especially on the ground strokes, than the previous string, just because that extra length control means I can swing faster without as much fear of overhitting as I would with the Tournament Nylon string. So that's another thing to take notice of. I was a lot more aggressive off of both wings when I needed to be in comparison to the Tournament Nylon string, and with that extra swing speed comes extra spin. So again, we've got access to more heights, we've got access to sharper angles, and we can also use a higher swing speed thanks to the extra length control. And those two combined gives us more spin on average, which again, when used correctly, gives us even more length control. So pretty cool combination of attributes. Onto the main weakness of this setup, and it is the trajectory control. When you've got a string that has a slightly lower stiffness in comparison to your previous string, and on top of that we have a deflection which is much higher than the previous string. It's at 33.1 millimeters. We are going to experience a decrease in the trajectory control, the height and width control on top of that. And that means if we're coming up against opponents that hit a heavy ball, they with a lot of pace spin, and they hit with a lot of depth consistently, it's going to be a struggle. A good example of this on the professional tour is Nadal. Oh, it was a good example. He's retired now, but when he was on tour, he did struggle in conditions that are a little bit quicker or against opponents that drove the ball deep consistently, just because his setup was very good in terms of length control, but in terms of controlling the height and trajectory, it was poor to say the least. So that is something we're going to have to bear in mind. If you play in conditions that are quick, if you play in locations that are hot and the surfaces are skiddy, you're not really going to get the best out of this string. Ideally, you'd like to be in a location where it's cold. So I'm in the UK and we're heading into winter now. It's it's mid-October, So when the conditions are colder, you get a lot more length control, and so I'm able to exploit the strengths of this string even more as the conditions get colder. And don't get me wrong, I don't really like playing in the cold, it's not that pleasant, but you know, a setup that exploits those conditions makes it a little bit more enjoyable, and cold conditions certainly do. So yeah, that is the main weakness, the lack of trajectory control in comparison to our previous setup. But if you manage to get yourself onto a surface that is slow enough, or if you're lucky enough to play in conditions that are cold enough to where you aren't going to be exploited by your opponent in terms of a lack of trajectory control, then you will still be able to get the absolute best out of this string. Right, so I'm just going to do a quick recap. The main strength was the extra length control, providing us with access to sharper angles, more extreme heights, and more RPMs, because that extra length control means that we can swing quicker with our racket on average without as much fear of hitting the ball beyond the baseline. And the main weakness was the lack of trajectory control. So if you play in quicker conditions, hotter conditions, you're not going to get the best out of this string. If you do play in conditions where the surface is a bit slower or the temperature is a lot colder, then that is going to amplify the strengths that this setup has to offer. Right, that's the end of part 1 of this setup analysis. I do have a couple more practice sets before I release the part 2 of this analysis, where I go into detail on a few more aspects of this string. That'll be coming out in the near future. So if you found this interesting, it might be worth staying tuned for that. And I want to thank everyone for watching. I do appreciate it. Hopefully I will see you all again in future. And until then, everyone, take care.